Okay, welcome. So today my plan is on the first half, we will continue to work on Bootstrap. Let's try to continue doing something else to our layout, but trying to implement the Bootstrap components. And then in the second half, well, let's see how it goes the first, what we can achieve. And then in the second one, we can start talking about Flask. That will be the framework that we will use for the backend, okay? So first of all, as usual, in the website, you can find here the code we will be working with. So if I suggest, if you have the computer, you can download the code so we can work all together, or maybe if you find something or figure out how to implement something, you are free to also encourage to suggest me something. And then, I have also updated the calendar, so we will have already the Flask slides here, okay? So, I wanted to show you something because I was reflecting that last time we were able to format some things in the header of our website, no? So we were able to set the image on the one side and the links on the other side. And now we were trying to replicate that, but using Bootstrap. I just wanted to check what happens if I try to use the classes that we already defined the last time by ourselves in the new Bootstrap file, and let's see how it behaves, the styles. So last time, for instance, we set this class header that we called my header. So let's see what happens if we apply my header to what we have been doing with Bootstrap. Okay, Okay, so what did we see here? That by applying the class myHeader, we are still applying the same styles that we defined by ourselves in our own CSS, okay? So once again, the fact that we decide to use Bootstrap doesn't mean that we won't use anymore the CSS that we have defined or we have worked on. Okay, so here, let's apply myHeader. We also define this class header logo. Indeed, let's copy this. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to make sure everyone gets is that we can still use our styles and integrate them with Bootstrap. Of course, we have to pay attention to how our styles were defined and how they match with what Bootstrap expects us to set in there, no? Because as we see, for instance, the row, how does the Bootstrap row behaves? As a flexbox, no? So if the styles that we are applying correspond to a flexbox item, they should be fine. But if they don't, then there will be a mismatch between the classes that Bootstrap has defined and the way Bootstrap defines the classes and the way we are defining the classes. So my advice here, once again, it's let's try to create always the layout and the responsiveness with Bootstrap, and then the elements within each component or each container, we can by ourselves, let's try to figure out how to implement them, okay? Once again, as with HTML, as with CSS, the same with Bootstrap. We can't pretend to learn everything or to memorize all of the possible commands, components, styles, and everything that Bootstrap has available. It's something that we learn as we try to implement things, as we try to customize things, as we try to implement and integrate components. We figure out how it works, okay? So my suggestion for today, because I think it's the most practical way of exploring the available CSS and see which one fits better for what we want, is try to take a look at the examples, and based on what the examples have, try to figure out which ones are the ones that fit better into what we want to implement, okay? And if in this case, I would also appreciate your collaboration, trying to find or suggesting in the website which ones we can use. So, once again, let's try to implement a header, but one that has a better looking than this one, one that looks more professional than this one, okay? So, in my case, for the header, I've seen, let me see. In the examples, I've seen something like, okay, here in the examples, there is this section called snippets, that it has the common patterns for building sites. So it is not just a specific CSS rule applied, but how the CSS, the Bootstrap CSS rules can be applied to build like common pieces of a website. So a header, of course, is a common piece of a website. So let's see the examples, and let's see which one might fit better what we want. Bob, which one do you think could be more similar to what we want? Which one do you like the most? In our initial So let's remember we are trying to build something like this, super simple. So we need on the one side the name and the logo maybe, and on the other side the sign in and the login button. So for instance here, this one could work. We don't expect to have the search, but if we don't need this one, we can erase the search bar. This one could be also very similar for with what we want, because it has like the links, it has the logo on the one side, and it has links in case we need to add something here, or in the worst case we can delete these links. And this one is nice because it has like the user and enables the user to log out, for instance. So maybe in the future we'll want also this one, because we want the user to log in, to log out, to see his profile, something like this. So which one do you like the most? The first one? This one? Yeah. Or, okay, the first one could work, and instead of example, questions, we can say login.
For the PC, it can be the first one, and it can change for like a phone.
Ah, yeah. Ah, yeah, and in the second case, to present it like this. Okay. Okay, well, let's try to see how the first one works. So in this case, there are two ways of implementing the CSS, or two ways to address the CSS. One of them is by downloading here the examples and the source code, and let's see how it works. But in this case, it downloads everything, okay? The other way, though, is to open the header, for instance, in here, and inspect the element. And by inspecting the element, copying the HTML of that specific element and pasting the HTML of that specific element into our HTML. So let's try to inspect the element so that we don't have to download the whole repository, but just copy the paste that we need. So as I was saying yesterday, the most important thing, or how it works, is not just copy pasting, but to understand which piece we are copying and how the piece that we are copying integrates or fits into the HTML structure that we already had, okay? So in this case, for instance, when we want to copy this snippet, we must first understand which specific portion of the site we are trying to get. So in this case, what are we referring to? To a header, no? So this is the header component that they have defined here and that we are trying to integrate into our layout. Then what else can we see here? That this header, in this case, is within a container, no? So we must ask ourselves, in our own layout, in our own HTML, where is the container defined, and take into account that this header should be ideally placed exactly as the first element within the container, okay? And then we have to take a look at the classes and try to understand what these classes do and how these classes behave and format the elements. So well, let's see what happens if we copy. Okay, so we copy pasted this header and it works fine. Okay, so far what we have done is copy pasting everything, and then my suggestion is that from here we will try to understand how that specific element works, no? And not just trying to copy paste and pretend it's magic, but let's try to understand how these classes, by their names, how do we infer that they work. So for instance, this dflex, what do you think it does? D might stand for display, maybe? Display flex. So this is the way in which Bootstrap sets that a container has a display flex. No? So instead of applying an style in which we define the display flex, Bootstrap has this, well, not a shortcut, but this name or this class that sets the display of that specific container as a flex container. So since this behaves as a flex, then we can see here, we already know what this is, no? We are familiar with flex wrap. What was this for? Do you remember when we had like the flex box? What happened with when we set the wrap property? That the elements that overflow something, then they are wrapped and they are placed below. Okay. So this flex wrap is the class, the Bootstrap class, that enables us to add that specific property or that specific feature to a flexbox. This justify content center, what does this mean? We are also familiar with this one because we saw like in plain CSS what this property was. So in this case, once again, it's a class that Bootstrap gives us, and by applying this class, we are saying that that specific container will behave according to that specific rule, okay? Then, what do you think this one represents? Y3? The? No. P stands for? Let's see what happens if I What do you think it is? Because when I set like a lower value, it has less space, and when I set a 5 value, for instance, that seems to be the maximum, it sets more space where? Above, so in the vertical axis. So we can say that the Y is for the vertical axis and the P stands for the padding, okay? So this is the way of applying the padding, not by defining a new CSS rule and importing, but through a Bootstrap class that stands for that. So it was 3. And then, if instead of y it were x, so we can say that the padding is being applied to the horizontal axis, okay? It is more or less intuitive, as I said before, and not that we will learn by memory all of these classes, but some of them, like the most representative ones or the ones that we will more typically use, is we will get used to them and to what they represent. Okay, so it was originally like this. What do we think this MB4 represents? The margin. So if P stands for padding, then M stands for margin. And this border bottom, I don't know if, let me check. Ah, yeah, it has this border. It is just that. Let's delete these ones. Or no, let's delete just this one. So here you can see that it has this border, you know? So if I remove this border bottom, what happens? Well, it deletes that border. So somehow, Bootstrap is practical because instead of having to define everything from scratch in our external CSS file, we can see which classes that Bootstrap provides us do the trick with what we want to format, okay? Question: does this way of doing the things violate or is against what we had promised, like in the first lessons, that we will never do? I mean, this, are we doing inline CSS in this case? Do you remember what inline CSS was? Like mixing CSS code with HTML within the same file, that we said we will never try to do something like that. Doing something like p style and set the CSS code exactly or directly within the HTML. Is this what we are doing with Bootstrap? No. Do you notice the difference between doing the things in this way and the way we are doing with Bootstrap? With Bootstrap, we are anyway using a class that has been defined somewhere else, okay? In this case, it is applying the CSS style directly within the HTML document, okay? So this is something we will never do, but we are doing with Bootstrap is completely different. Do you see the difference between both of them? And do you see why we won't use this one and why we're using the other one? Okay. Indeed, something that I didn't show you yesterday. Do we all agree that this border bottom, that if we wanted, we can implement our own border bottom, for instance? So just to give you an example, so I can be completely sure that we get all the concept. If I want to create my own border bottom, for instance, or some style that I want to reuse among different components, what I would do is just come here, and I could say like introduction to web applications border. And this is a border that I can use instead of this one. That I don't know exactly. Okay, and apply this. So it's exactly the same. It is just that Bootstrap has also named the classes in such a way that we can understand, or that they have a semantic, so that when we apply p, y, 3, we know that we are applying the padding to the vertical axis, and that we are setting a specific measure for that. What does this mean? Something that I didn't show you yesterday, and it means that here in this URL, we will find all of the CSS code that Bootstrap has implemented. So it is not magic. Once again, here is all of the implementation that they have done of the CSS that we have and that works in our case. Okay, so we are basically using the CSS code written by someone else. Is this clear? Is this conceptually clear? Okay, so at some point here in the CSS, we will find the place where that specific class has been defined, okay? Okay, questions so far? Does it work also for you in your computer? Yep.
How can I change the color of the home features personally?
Of these ones, there are two ways. We can set the nav item and add a specific class to this one. So for instance, let me see. Nav or item. Indeed. Okay, let me check something. Okay, and okay, so on the one hand, here we have the explanation for all of the classes that the Bootstrap has defined to deal with a specific color palette or a specific subset of colors. That they define like the primary color, the secondary color, the warning color, that are basically like these ones, no? So this one, they define like a body, secondary, tertiary, emphasize, border, and they define like a predefined set of colors. There is the chance to modify all of these predefined set of colors by changing the value of these variables. So that's one alternative. Then, if we want to see in that specific element that is the navigation bar how to deal with the color, we can take a look at the exact definition of. So here, for instance, we have the pills that are the ones that we are applying there. And I think here, they should say something about the color. Oh, let me check. Well, I'll try to figure out later and I'll let you know because I don't know specifically where the color for these nav fields work. I'll check that specific property for these fields, okay? Okay, so home features. Okay, and let's take into account that this works as a list. So if we delete these ones, we will be able to leave the ones that we want, no? That is like sign in. And the other one was login, maybe. Yeah. Does it work for you? Everything? No, because I'm trying to figure out why, for instance, this one remains stick to this one. Because in the original example, I think it was Bon. Does in your case, when you try to implement this, the header stays sticked to the buttons, to the pills? Okay, let me try to remove the. So it has to do with something that happens when we delete Let's check how this. Okay, did you see what happened in this case? So when I had like 5 links, it worked because anyway, well, the 5 links occupied like a lot of space, and then there was the logo on the one side, so it seemed like they were wrapped and they were on the same line, okay? When there were just 2 links, what happened? The 2 links moved towards the center, so it remained sticked, the logo with the links, okay? We already know how this works with Flexbox, no? Because in Flexbox we had the chance to split 2 elements and set one in one way, one extreme of the header and the other one in the other extreme, okay? So we know how to do that with the CSS Flexbox styles or with the CSS rules, okay? Here, what I told you is that this element behaves as a flexbox because it has deflex. So what was my reasoning in here? What's going wrong? It had to do something with the placement of the elements within that flexbox. So if I take a look at the classes that here are having an impact on the container, then I can see or identify that this one was the one that concerned the placement of the elements. How do I know that? Well, because by reading the name of the class, I can get an idea that this has to do with the placement, because it was like justify content center, okay? So since we already know that in Flexbox we have the option of justify content center, I went to the Bootstrap documentation and tried to find what's the class that instead of justifying the elements in the center, sets the elements with a space between. And then I could find the class justify content between. Okay? Why do I tell you all of this? Because when you will be working with Bootstrap, it won't be just copy pasting, in the sense that sometimes you will see that when you try to integrate something that you see in the examples or in the snippets into your specific HTML, you will find some differences, something you won't expect to work as it should work or to see as it should see. And we must be able to make sense of the CSS and try to understand where to fix something or how to change the thing so that it works, okay? And this is why it was also important to learn CSS first, because without knowing anything about CSS, it would be impossible to make sense of what the classes mean. Up to now, everything clear? Questions? Okay. So do we like the new header as it is? So let's remove the previous one and continue. Then we have this class that is supposed to be the one for the navigation bar. Okay, so the same procedure. So here let's try to find in the examples that I think is the most practical way a navigation bar that fits with what we want. So here I had identified here we have nav bars, for instance. Let's see this one, for instance. But let me check something. Let's check this one. That is useful also for introducing a new concept. Okay, so first of all, what is important here if I want to use this example? To identify what this example refers to, what I'm copying into what I'm trying to copy into my HTML. So what I'm trying to get in this example, I'm trying to get the nav element or the nav component that is represented here. Where does it fit into my HTML? It should fit here. That was where previously I had my nav, my empty nav bar, where I have defined the structure of my website. So first of all, it's important to get here how this integrates with my HTML. So let's copy the snippet and let's paste it here. So first of all, in this case, for instance, within the navigation, they define the container class. Do we need that container class that is defined there? Maybe not, because we have already defined the container class above and outside, no? Because in this case, for instance, I've defined here the class container, and within I've been integrating the elements. So here, do I need this container within the navigation bar? Well, maybe not. Let's see how it looks in the browser. So it occupies, well, until here. Let's see what happens if I remove this class. Okay, it behaves the same. So we could say we're fine without that class, okay? Let me delete. Okay, so here I have the navigation bar. Do we need this nav bar? Well, maybe not. for what we are trying to implement, maybe we don't need that specific of that. So here we can delete this navbar. And then, question. If I remove the navigation bar and now I have the links the way I want them to look, okay? Question, why when I get to a smaller one, instead of showing the links, it shows me this element? Because? Yeah, because it has like the responsive, the responsive behavior that by stretching the viewport, then it shows me the link. That, in theory, what should happen when I click on this? It should open like the links below, no? Like in the example, basically. Like in this example. Why, in our case, it doesn't work? Right now, if I click here, nothing happens. Why do you think it is? We need JavaScript. We still don't know what JavaScript is, but at this point, we know we need JavaScript. Why do we need JavaScript? Or why do you think it was the issue?
Because JavaScript helps with actions through the website, like changing the behavior of the website, whether I click somewhere.
Sure, because JavaScript is like the language that can dynamically change the way that the HTML behaves and the way that the HTML looks. So without JavaScript, we are not able to add interaction to the website. Okay, so let's try to add JavaScript. So up to this point, in our websites, we just have the HTML and the CSS, nothing else. How do you think we could add JavaScript, or where do you think the JavaScript could be added? In another file, .js. So the same way as we have CSS files, we also can have JS files that are JavaScript files. Okay. Up to now, we have integrated like the external resources into the head. No. So first of all, we should get the JavaScript that Bootstrap provides us, because it is the JavaScript where they defined how their button, their navigation bar button should behave, okay? So, this is another important issue. Up to now, I will just say you that we will download the JavaScript, the Bootstrap JavaScript, but we still don't know how JavaScript works. Up to now, you will just get the idea that we copy-paste the JavaScript import button and the import script, and then we will see how it works, okay? So in this case, we come to Bootstrap. And here, did you see that when we copy-pasted the CSS, that was the one here, there was also below the JavaScript? So here, this one, as you can see, has the real style sheet. That is the one we already know how to deal with. And then in here, we have this one is not a link anymore, but this one is a script, okay? So we will still copy this one, and it is different from the CSS. The script, the JavaScript, we will not paste in the header, in the head of the HTML, but we will paste it before closing the body of the HTML, okay? So here, we will paste the JavaScript, okay? And by doing this, now we have once again, the responsive behavior that shows us the button, the collapse button. But now when we click on the collapse button, we can see the elements in there, okay? Is it clear? Questions? Basta. Okay. Do you have questions? Is everything clear? Does it work? Nice. So in our case, we had in the layout that we have designed first, we had find a tutor, history, my favorites, my announcements, and who we are. So let's try to replicate that. Okay. Are we happy with the navigation bar in this way? I don't know if we had also okay, of course, in the examples, you won't find the exact example with the exact same number of links or with the exact same structure. So that's why it is handy or useful or is a requirement to understand how HTML works. So in this case, for instance, reading from the HTML, I can identify that these links are set up here as an ordered list, no? So that if I want to add another link, what I have to do is to copy a list element and to replicate that down and change basically the name. Fine. Let's try to create the description one and the footer, and then we stop, okay? So for the description, I've seen, for instance, this one. Well, something like this. Do we like this one for the description? I'm thinking like of a section in the website that says, welcome to Imparato, and then below some quick description and two buttons for something. We can use this one. This one is pretty simple. Or we can use something like, maybe like this one. that is nicer, but this one has an image. So then we would need to find an image to set in there. So which one do you prefer, the one without the image or the one with the image and then we find something to place there? Without? Do we all like without? Okay. I don't know if it has been completely clear how do I copy paste the elements. Okay, in Safari at least it is with copy and then I clear and I click HTML. Okay, so that it copies all the HTML with the CSS included. And then let's see how so before, let's take into account that I had important. Here, something that you will be always struggling with in HTML is to make sure that you have closed what you have opened. No? So before, it was super easy because our HTML was super simple. So we just had like a few lines. But then, as you see here, as soon as we start to add more and more content, the HTML starts to grow. So for instance, in here, I noticed that the last line was closing the navigation bar, okay, the nav. And after that, okay, I had the div here that should correspond to the div representing the row, okay? But I'm still missing a closing div here for the container, because if you remember, our structure was the container, and within the container we had the rows. So we had the container here that was opened here, and that we are closing by the end of the HTML, and within the container we have the div for the rows. Okay. Why do I say this? Because you will be always trying to check that after integrating, after copy pasting the things from Bootstrap, the structure still remains consistent. And as you can see here, for instance, anyway, the HTML will work. It won't give you any error or any mistake. It will still work. But the problem is that sometimes the components might display different from what you expect them to display, just because of this, because the structure is not consistent or because you are not closing the elements where you are supposed to close them. Nice. So now that we are sure that it is fine, so once again, I'm sorry if I am repetitive with this, but you will see in the lab that this is important. First of all, before copy pasting everything, we must first be sure in which part of the HTML we will paste what we are trying to import from Bootstrap. So in this case, I already know that this container is the one that represents the main section of the site. So I'm sure that I'm copy pasting this element in there. And now the website looks like this. Okay. We're missing here an image, but well, we can find the logo or we can find something. If, for instance, we see this, how this looks, and we don't like because the pad or the margin or the space in there is too much, what should we expect to be changing in the HTML? Well, we for sure will come here and try to try to play with this variable and see how it behaves when we change it. Or if we remove the variable, what happens, for instance. So if, for instance, we remove that variable, then you can see that the space here is not there anymore. Or if we play with the margin variable, instead of 5, we set 1, then you can see that the space is even smaller in the top. Okay. Now that we have, for instance, used this centered hero text, that is the H1, let's try to make sense of the classes that are new for us that we have brought from Bootstrap. So, for instance, in this case, what can we infer from this one? That is a class that sets the text to bold. No? What can we infer from this one? That is a class that somehow applies some emphasis on the text. If we are not sure how that specific class works, what should we do? Copy the class and paste it on the Bootstrap website and see from the documentation specifically which are the changes that that specific class is implementing. Okay, this lead is also something concerning the text and how the text is shown here. So with this style, with this font style, I know it because I have used it before, but once again, if we are not sure how a specific class works, we can always search how it works on the documentation. We already know this one, that should be margin bottom 4. This one is interesting. Do you remember that before we had dflex? So dgrid, what is? Display grid, okay? And within the display grid, justify content in the center when we have this specific breakpoint. Indeed, what do you think this one stands for? Sure. So display flexbox when it gets bigger than small. Okay. So this one seems pretty simple, but it's super powerful because we are saying that depending on the display that we have, on the viewport that we have, we can set a different display for the same element. So we want it to behave as a flexbox when it is big. No, we want to behave as a flexbox when it is big, and we want it to behave as a grid when it is small. Okay? So in this case, this one is behaving as a grid, and in this case, when it gets bigger, this specific portion of the website is behaving as a flexbox. Okay, are we happy with the description? Okay. check something. So why do you think that? Let's do something else in there in the main section, because do you remember that in our sketch we had the description, but it was just in the middle portion of the website, because we still have to leave space for the right space and for the left space. Okay, so it can't occupy the whole screen. So in Bootstrap, we already know that the row behaves as a flexbox. And within the row, we have columns, okay? The portion of the website that we are using now, the description is occupying everything because it is not behaving as a column. We are just, within the row, we are inserting like a container, and it is occupying everything. If we want it to behave as a column, what should we do? Add the column class. So here I said, for instance, call 8. And now do you see that it doesn't occupy everything, but it just occupies, well, 8 columns up to here probably? So if we want to add the sections at the beginning and at the end, what should we do? Create 2 more columns, no? The one that I will set on the left and the one that I will set in the right. So are these columns fine? This column's fine. So first I added this one that will occupy 4, and then I add the last one that will occupy 4. All of them within the main section. That is, and the main section represents the row. Is this layout okay? So, because do you remember it has always to be 12? So we must take into account that if I'm allocating 2 columns for the first, for the sidebar, and 4 columns for the last one, I'm just leaving a space for another 4, okay? So maybe we can try with something like 3, and 6 here. Okay, and now it is centered. And just to show you that it is working, let's write something else, like what was supposed to be here, the search. And the other one was the most popular. Okay, so well, this is trivial, but this is just to show that we can play with the columns, we can play with the flex layout, and then we can set the spaces and basically start to build the interface in this way. And here, instead of 6, 8. Last thing, do we always want the 2 sidebars to be placed there? No, ideally we want that if the screen is small, then they place like stacked, one below the other one. So who says me which classes to use to achieve that specific behavior? So in here, maybe what I suggest is, first of all, try to think how you would like it to behave when it is super small. No? So when it is super small, we want that each of these 3 elements in the row occupy the whole screen, so the whole width. So it'd be like 12. And 12. Like this. This one occupies the whole screen, then there is the other below, and then there is the last one. Okay. Now what should we do? Yeah. So when it is not small anymore, but between small and medium, how do we want them to behave? No. So for instance, in here we could say that we want them to stay the same. If we open the website from an iPad, we want still that it occupies the whole screen and one below the other one. So in this case, we could say that call small is still fine, still okay with this. But then, finally, we say that from an iPad up to a super big screen, we want it to show as it was showing before. So this will occupy 2. And call MD8. So what happens here, that with the big screen, it has like the previous, as we have said it before, no? Why? Because in these rules, we say that from medium up to the biggest one, I want this one to occupy 8, I want this to occupy 2, and the other one to occupy 2 columns, so it's fine. Then when it gets to the iPad size, that should be here, it responsively sets this one to 12, this one to 12, and this one to 12, okay? And then, when it gets smaller, it remains the same. Why it remains the same? Because by default, we have set that, or assigned these specific values that was 12, 12, 12, okay? So this main section of the website is a good example of how the responsiveness works and how the breakpoints can be used by using the Bootstrap classes. Okay, up to now, questions? Yeah.
There's no way we can visualize first the introduction when the website is visualized on a smartphone, for example, since
Yeah, in that case, I would erase the search directly. I mean, in that case, because I agree, this kind of display is kind of weird because it's, I mean, the center hero loses relevance when you have like the search on the one side. So in that case, I would delete the search and the most popular tutors and maybe add them in a section below. Okay? Now, the way I implemented this way is just to keep consistent with the sketch, and also because by doing in that way I had the chance to show you how the responsiveness could be applied there. But yeah, in my case I would leave, for instance, this description that in our case is like the hero. I would let it occupy everything, and then below I would create like another main section or another row within that section, and there I would add like the 3 columns. Ah, because you mean to make these ones disappear?
Not disappear, but I mean
to hide.
no. Just when we're using as markers for a tablet, when we land the page, I would like to visualize the description first rather than the search.
Okay, to change the order of the. No, but with the media query, how would you implement that to change the order of the elements?
I would rewrite the HTML code, so inverting, swapping the introduction with the search.
Yeah, because the problem with that specific issue is that it doesn't have to do with the style, but with the order of the elements. So, and the order of the elements are defined with the HTML, not with the classes. So more than a media query, it has maybe more to do with a JavaScript, because JavaScript is something that can modify the HTML order. Okay, so in that case, I would say it has more to do like with a JavaScript that, based on the device width, sets one element before the other one. In this case, what we can do is like hide an element and then maybe make visible an element below that has basically the same content. So that's a trick we might do, like create a portion of the website that is shown when the responsiveness or when the screen size is 1, and then have a replicated portion of the website below, but you play with the visibility of the elements depending on the responsiveness of the website. I think that's like the best option. Okay. Nice. So we will make a stop here, take a 15-minute break, and then we continue. Okay.